Hello, I'm Dr. Mary Ann Cusimano-Love, and I'm coming to you from the Catholic University of America here in Washington, D.C. I'm happy to talk with you today about women, religious, and strategic peace building. I'm sorry my broken foot precludes me from joining you at the event today, but I appreciate your patience. Also, following the lead of Pope Francis, I'd ask you to keep me in your prayers. As this Assembly of Women Religious, I know you're a lot of praying folks, a female face of faith, and so please do keep me in your prayers today. Our topic is women, religious, and strategic peace building. And we'll be looking at, here's kind of the thrust, the heart of the presentation in one slide. We'll be looking at women religious are peace builders in war zones around the world. And why is that? There are a number of reasons which we'll unpack in a minute. There's demographics, there's location, that women religious tend to be forward deployed in areas of conflict when war breaks out. That can lead them to become accidental peace builders. They are in areas when conflict comes to their area, they're ministering and working with marginalized or poor communities. Their mission of serving people in need leads them to be the first responders to people impacted by conflict in war zones. And they have great relational capacity because of the types of work they do that can lead them to have relationships with people across the conflict lines, whether those conflicts are sectarian, ethnic, tribal, what have you. In a world of resurgent religion and challenged states, none of these criteria that I've just mentioned are going away anytime soon. So women religious are going to continue to be at the front lines in war zones and to have needed capacity for peace building. They have what I call the 3 I's. They have the I of institutions, they have the I of ideas that can be useful for peace building, and the I of imagination, bringing a lot of imagination and creativity to how to solve conflicts. This can be a real game changer to bring those different 3 I's to bear on the conflict setting. The challenge for these women religious is how to go from reactive, from the accidental peace builder who happens to be doing their mission in a war zone, to strategic peace building. And that is really going to rely on their being able to get better connected, to be able to be integrating the various types of conflict resolution that they're engaged in, to try to be aiming toward that goal line of peace that's more sustainable, building a more just and sustainable peace. So that's the heart of the presentation in a nutshell. Now we're going to unpack some of that a bit by bit. So the demographic component. Why is it that women religious are peace builders in war zones around the world? Well, partly this is just basic demographics. There are more women than men around the world. 85% of people on the planet are religious. They believe in a supreme being or a higher power. And of those people who self-describe themselves as religious, by far women are more religious than men. Every study that's ever been done on this for decades, in every religion, every religious tradition, and every region of the world, this empirical finding is proven true, that women are more religious than men. So that means just in terms of basic demographics, there are going to be women religious in areas of war. They're going to be on the front lines of war zones because of those demographics, whether the wars have a sectarian dimension to them or not. And because of that basic demographic, they're also going to be very likely, because of the mission work that these women religious do, they're very likely to be forward deployed, to be present in areas where conflict is likely to break out. Why is that? Well, what we know from the World Bank, from their data on the conflict track, is that the good news is peace is breaking out around the world. Lots of areas from Northern Ireland to the Philippines to Colombia, where there have been decades and decades of conflict, peace has been breaking out, and they've been able to get some movement towards more sustainable peace. So what the good news is, peace is breaking out in many areas of the world. The bad news is that is not universal, and there's still many areas of the world that are caught in very severe cycles of conflict. Now, what do we know about those places in the world where conflict is still reigning, where there's still very, very intense violence? Well, we know that the risk is greatest if a country has suffered a previous cycle of violence in the past 5 years, if they have a low per capita income, an area of poverty, or even if it's a middle income country like Iraq or Syria, if they are in economic decline. And if they have a youth bulge, and again, remembering that at youth bulge, a large number of young people are in a declining economy, that means that you have youth who are having difficulty accessing economic or educational opportunities. They have difficulty getting jobs, which means they are available for recruitment by violent groups. So the youth bulge, the declining income, the cycle of violence in the past 5 years, and a particular type of economy, particularly if they are dependent on natural resources, whether it's oil or some other type of extractives, that leads to a not very diversified economy and more competition, kind of a winner takes all to capture those economic resources. So countries that have that particular profile, those red flags, are more likely to be countries that are having trouble breaking out of these cycles of conflict. Well, what do we know about the work of women religious? This is precisely the types of places around the world where they are likely to be working. They're going to be working in areas of poverty. They're going to be working with children and youth. They're going to be working in education and economic development. And so they're going to be working in the areas where conflict is most likely to break out. 80% of the world's 20 poorest countries have suffered a major conflict in recent years. So there's a great deal of concentration of conflict in these places where there have been previous cycles of violence and they're having trouble breaking out. So given the demographics, given what we know about conflict analysis, we know that women religious are going to be on the front lines in areas of war. So the challenge then becomes, how can they move from being reactive, accidental peace builders who are working in an area when conflict breaks out, to being more strategic in their ability to bring their capacities, bring their assets, bring their networks, and bring their skill sets to the task of peace building. What do I mean by the word strategic peace building? Well, it means beginning with the local issues, which is where we usually all begin, and being able to then connect those local issues with national and international actors, institutions, and perhaps resources and capacities. Strategic peace building integrates the various aspects of conflict transformation practices and tries to make those conflict transformation practices more complementary, to move beyond stopping physical violence and instead moving to issues of structural violence, structural injustice, to try to create a more robust, more sustainable, just peace. So the key words there in looking at strategic peace building is that it be connected, that it be integrated, and that it be sustainable. So knowing that women religious live and work in war zones and have extensive on-the-ground experience developing and leading peace-building programs that are composed of women, by women, and for women and other marginalized groups, the groups that women religious tend to work with. How can I give you an example of what I mean of moving from reactive to more strategic? I'm going to give you some examples of women religious on the front lines in Iraq, where I've had the privilege of meeting some tremendous, inspirational, and very creative and courageous women religious peace builders this past spring. But the examples I give from the Dominican Sisters of Iraq and other religious peace builders in Iraq are by no means unique to them. The pattern I'll discuss is a pattern that's pretty universal, and we see the same pattern across religious groups, across regions, and across different types of conflict. So you know from the headlines that ISIL has been ravaging Iraq, that this is the latest phase in a conflict. Iraq has had previous cycles of conflict that has really destroyed and undercut the society there. They have that declining economy, they have that youth bulge, they have that previous cycles of conflict, they have an economy that's heavily dependent on natural resources of oil. And so they have all those red flags waving. The latest phase of the conflict, the combatants, of course, are ISIL. And they, in the summer of 2014, went on a rampage, and really the people had to flee in great numbers across the plains of Nineveh. You all saw in the headlines and very moving media coverage of that. Now, ISIL was not an unknown force to the Dominican Sisters of Iraq. They knew the people who were comprised in this combatant force. And how did they know them? Because of their long-term ministry to people in this region. Their work in healthcare, in hospitals, in education, meant that they were ministering to people across sectarian lines, and so they knew many of the youth who then became involved or recruited for ISIL. So that meant that the sisters, while at the one hand they were fleeing from the conflict and fleeing from the onslaught of ISIL, they also often informally became engaged in negotiations with them, asking them for mercy, asking them for people to release particular people or let people leave the areas as ISIL was advancing. As ISIL came and seized the convents and churches and property of the sisters, they also started calling the sisters, after the sisters left and fled the plains of Nineveh, they were calling them on their cell phones and were in communications with them. So these networks that the sisters have can lead them to be, that women religious have, can lead them to be in very interesting places in the conflict zone. So the women religious fled along with everyone else, many other religious minorities, the Yazidis and others, who fled the plains of Nineveh in the summer of 2014. And often many different internally displaced persons. There were also refugees fleeing across international borders from Syria into the Kurdish area of Iraq, often sought shelter in churches. This is St. Joseph's Cathedral in Erbil, which is the Kurdish region of Iraq, when that huge human migration took place of people fleeing ISIL. This obviously led to a population in great need, a very vulnerable population who'd fled the war zone with just the clothes on their back. And the sisters were among those internally displaced persons who had fled the conflict. But they began immediately to continue their ministry to their population, to their community. The time when they fled in August of 2014 was very, very hot in Iraq. So people were dropping over, were expiring from heat exhaustion, from stroke, from heart attack in this horrendous heat and the great stress of fleeing ISIL. So the sisters immediately, on their very first day of displacement, began by setting up a mobile medical clinic in a tent and ministering to the people who were impacted by conflict, themselves included. So they began with, and this is a typical response of women religious around the world, again, not a unique story to the Dominican Sisters of Iraq, that women religious are those first responders in war zones, attending to the immediate survival needs of the war-torn population, whether those needs are housing, emergency assistance, health care, and then scaling up to education, jobs, livelihood, trauma healing, reconciliation. So the sisters began within the first 2 days. They had established 2 mobile medical clinics and tents, again, while themselves internally displaced and living in temporary housing as it developed. Even when the women religious may not be the providers of temporary housing or shelter, other third parties may come in, whether it's the United Nations or other NGOs. These women religious are often the interlocutors who speak for the needs of the community and can be seen as leaders who have a great deal of experience because of their long-term relationships with these communities of need. They are not people who have just parachuted in for the war zone. These are people who have long-term sustainable relations with the community in need. Within the first year, the sisters had moved from just provision of emergency services to building phenomenal schools and providing for the educational needs of the young. Now, this was not just a matter of providing traditional services that women religious provide, but this was a matter of peace building. The refugee and IDP communities did not speak the language of the local schools. There wasn't the capacity in the local schools to absorb these huge influx of humanity with these huge levels of numbers of IDPs. So the sisters stepped up their activities. They were able to bring in international donors and set up some tremendous schools as well as kindergartens and preschools. Now, this is not just provision of education. The sisters are not just working on the students' ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, although they certainly are doing those basic primary education functions. But they are also integrating across the curriculum peace building, and they're doing it in very creative ways. These refugee and IDP children have experienced war firsthand. They have witnessed great violence, they've fled their homes, they've lost everything. And there's a great deal of stress that continues on them in their families because they continue in areas of great uncertainty with a very marginal existence in temporary housing. They often may not have the ability to exercise, to run around, to go to fields or play soccer. They may not have the ability to do music or the things that a child would usually do because they are in very cramped temporary housing for refugees and IDPs. So the sisters have integrated exercise, music, art, yoga, even conflict training in the curriculum to try to teach children nonviolent means of dispute resolution within their families and within their communities, other ways of solving conflict other than violence. They've also integrated prayer in ways that are not simply your basic, straightforward religious education. Because this conflict in Iraq and the latest phase with ISIL has been a targeting of minority religious communities and targeting of religious sites, people do not feel safe in their basic normal religious practices. So providing safe spaces where children could have quiet time, meditate, and pray was not just basic religious education 101, but is a peace-building opportunity for the children to process the trauma that they've experienced, to take it to God in ways that are natural and age-appropriate to them, and in ways that help them to feel safe again in their religious practice when their religious practice was, in this particular conflict, targeted for violence. So, for example, while I was there was a child in the prayer room who said, after coming out of their quiet meditation time, God told me not to worry, that our homes and churches we left behind are going to be safe because the angels are praying back home in our churches. So this is very creative ways in which women religious have integrated peace building across the curriculum. For example, in art, in helping the children to process the violence they've experienced through art. This is an example of some of the artwork the children were doing. My dream is to go back to my city, to see my house, school, neighbors, and friends again. So they're engaging in and integrating peace education and trauma healing in ways that are very holistic for them because they are a trusted service provider to provide education and activities for the young. Some of the other ways they're engaging in trauma healing is to scale it up, not only in the schools, because obviously you can only reach school-aged populations in the schools, but to make those trauma healing services available to the wider community. But again, the religious peace builders in this case are thinking very creatively about how to do that. Who do they train and hire for these trauma healing centers? Well, they're trying to use that as an opportunity for youth empowerment, for youth economic development, to provide jobs and educational opportunities for youth. So the youth who are having a lot of time on their hands, who are IDPs or refugees, who are from conflict impacted communities, that they have some positive, constructive things to occupy themselves and don't become the next recruits available to the armed combatants. They also take this integrative approach in their approach to economic development. So you see lots and lots of, these are examples from Jesuit refugee services, in which the types of activities you would expect a faith-based organization who's involved in humanitarian response to be involved in economic development and livelihood activities. But the way they provide those economic development and livelihood training activities are ways that integrate those activities across the dividing lines, the conflict lines in societies. So here you have women learning computer skills at Jesuit Refugee Services IDP Center. And they're Muslim women, they're Yazidi women, they're various different sects of Christian women, and they're coming together in their livelihood training across and building relationships across those dividing lines of the conflict. So whether they're doing beautician training, whether they're doing training to be cooks or bakers, or computer training, you see a lot of women's economic empowerment and educational empowerment, but building relationships across those conflict lines. This is an example from Catholic Relief Services, and while they are serving urban refugees who often are not living in camps but are living in abandoned, half-finished housing, they're providing services to those refugees in ways that also engage the local communities, the people who live there all the time, not only providing services for the internally displaced persons or refugees. Again, this helps to build relationships and strengthen relationships and social cohesion across the conflict lines. So you don't deliver humanitarian services in ways that inflame the local community and have the local community feel like the new upstarts who come to our community now have access to resources that we are excluded from. By the way, most of these faith-based organizations, whether it's the examples I've used of Catholic Relief Services or Jesuit Refugee Services or the Sisters, are providing services to all based on need, not creed. That's their own terminology for how they describe their work. And often the people employed by these organizations are not Catholics or Christians, but whatever the religious demographic is in that community in which they serve. So Catholic Relief Services, Jesuit Refugee Services is primarily staffed by Muslims in Muslim-majority countries, and they're primarily serving Muslims in Muslim-majority countries. So again, these are ways in which religious organizations, which often have women as the leaders of those organizations, are serving to build relationships across those conflict lines. Now again, I gave you this example from Iraq just because I happened to be there this past spring, and so that was a very recent example for me to talk about. But this is not a unique example to Iraq. Women of faith live and work in war zones and have extensive on-the-ground experience developing and leading peace-building programs composed of women, by women, and for women, and other marginalized groups across religious traditions. So Muslim, Buddhist, all these various religious traditions and all these various regions, we see that same pattern of women religious being in war zones, providing services to war-torn communities, and then scaling up that work to be more strategic. One of the more well-known examples, of course, was portrayed in the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, looking at the work that women religious did to bring the war in Liberia to an end, very strategic. But we see that same pattern, that same trajectory in many places of women religious moving from reactive, accidental peace building to a more strategic peace building that's more connected, more integrated, and more sustainable. Now, how is it they're able to make that leap? Well, there are many characteristics, many assets that women religious peace builders have that can be helpful in making that move to be more connected, integrated, sustainable, to be more strategic in their peace building. Women religious are skilled in creating and leveraging decentralized networks. So they're well positioned to engage in this strategic peace building and to use those strategic networks that they have. So for example, the examples we just talked about, they may have relationships with people across the conflict lines, across various aspects of society, and they can then bring those networks to bear on peace building. So they bring their relational networks and their skill sets that they have, the people skills particularly, and they bring them to bear across all phases of peace building. Women religious are engaged in conflict prevention. Their work in peace education, in economic development, even natural resource and environmental management is aimed at trying to prevent the next phase of conflict from breaking out. We've also seen them as emergency responders, as the first responders while conflict rages and the war is hot, in responding and serving conflict-impacted communities. whether that's ministering to refugees and IDPs, the poor, the sick, whether it's engaging in trauma healing work, or sometimes even mediating among the armed groups. Then in the longer term, and even in the post-conflict phases, they are very engaged in reconciliation, forgiveness, continued trauma healing work, and expansion of economic and political participation and inclusion, particularly inclusion and participation of women and youth. And as they do that, that helps to improve community resilience to make that peace more real, more just, and more sustainable. So they often work across faith, across class, across ethnicity lines, across these various lines that may be part of the conflict. The pros that they bring to this strategic peace building work is that they have this experience through this engaged practice, particularly with marginalized communities. They can be creative. New ideas and imagination for what might work can emerge. Also because as women and as religious, they themselves may often be excluded from the power structures. Women religious then tend to be more sensitive to patterns of exclusion or limitations on participation. So they can often be questioning, based on their lifetimes of experience with excluded communities, they can be very attentive to whose voice is missing from a discussion and how that voice needs to be included and that participation needs to be expanded. They have the potential to be what I call the missing middle. So John Paul Lederach is a very famed and esteemed colleague from Eastern Mennonite University and the Kroc Institute of Peace at Notre Dame University. And in his work on conflict transformation, he talks about a triangle with elites at the top and grassroots peace builders at the bottom. But what's missing from John Paul Lederach's idea of peace building is that middle, that missing middle. Finding and building that capacity of those mediators that can relate to both the elites at the top and the grassroots at the bottom can be difficult in conflict-impacted communities where the middle has not held or the middle has been decimated. They may have been killed or they may have fled. So women religious have that potential to play that very important role that can be very helpful in trying to rebuild social cohesion, being that missing middle. They can be that missing middle because they can cross borders between the conflict groups, between masses and elites, and between local and international networks. They have leadership and organizational skills that can be a very practical asset. They have tenacity and they have a long-term view. They've been in a relationship with these local communities for a long time, and they can have that longer-term view that often some of the more professional peace building groups don't have because they don't necessarily have those long-term relationships. They may be parachuting in when a conflict gets hot and leaving as that conflict might cool. Women religious, unfortunately, however, some of the challenges they face, the cons, are that they can be overlooked, particularly by the governmental power structures or even the intergovernmental structures, the United Nations or IGOs. They can be overlooked, they can be under-resourced, they can be underestimated, and this can lead to burnout. If they are engaged in very heavy activities in frontline, as first responders in the front lines of conflict, that can lead to burnout, so the work may not be able to be sustainable. The strategic invisibility that women religious employ can be a very double-edged sword. On the one hand, they may deliberately be working under the radar and out of the limelight in order to be able to get more done. It also may come from their own religious commitments. Sometimes they take vows of humility or have humility as one of their religious orientations. They can be very comfortable working behind the scenes, and women religious can do this very strategically. They're trying to help conflict-impacted, traumatized communities to reclaim their sense of agency, to help local partners take ownership and credit for their projects. So therefore, when they take a low-profile, humble approach, it is on purpose, intentional, and strategic in order to be able to raise up the agency of the conflict-impacted local community. But that behind-the-scenes approach is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can lead them to be able to get into very interesting places. On the other hand, it can make it more difficult for them to connect to resources and capacities. So for example, a lot of what I've been discussing is from my chapter today in this book that has recently been released, Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, Illuminating the Unseen. And you'll be hearing from Susan Hayward this afternoon. He'll be talking about more of some of the content that we examine in this book. She's one of the co-editors of the book. I was one of the contributors. But what's interesting here is what the subtitle of our book is, Illuminating the Unseen. Every religion has women peacebuilders. Every religion has them in various regions and various areas of conflict. Why, if they are so ubiquitous in these regions of conflict, do we refer to them as unseen? Why are they often unappreciated, and is there the need to illuminate it? And this book talks about the work of various religious communities in various aspects of conflict, various places of conflict. So Muslim women working in the Philippines, many other examples. So I do recommend the book to you. This is that double-edged sword that I made reference to before. Women religious in part are easy to trust in these vulnerable situations by communities that are impacted by conflict precisely because they are excluded from the formal power structures. So they can seem clean, they're not corrupt, they're not the violent contributors to the conflict. They may even have an independence from the male religious structures and hierarchy, which can be important to people who are not connected to those religious structures or if sectarian violence is part of the conflict. So that exclusion from the formal power structure can be their calling card that allows people to trust them, that they are not part of the corruption or they're not part of the conflict themselves. That invisibility that they bring, that being outsiders, can get them into places that really boggle the mind because they are not seen as threatening. So that's the pro of that strategic invisibility. But the con of that is that it can allow them to be excluded, to be unseen, as we talked about in the book, by the formal state, government, and intergovernmental UN structures. Women religious are often doubly excluded. They are excluded because they are women, and we see women excluded from power structures around the world. And they can also be excluded because they are religious. So there's been a lot of movement in recent years with UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the subsequent inclusive security resolutions to increase the participation of women in peace-building activities in all phases of peace-building. Increase the participation of women in both governmental and intergovernmental peace-building activities. But as that movement has taken place and all countries have been asked to create a national action plan for how they're going to do better in including women in formal peace processes, the inclusion has often been to secular women and secular NGOs, and not to women of faith-based organizations who may be seen as suspect by those secular NGOs and secular women. On the other hand, there's been a movement to have greater inclusion of religious actors in peace building. But as the inclusion of religious actors has expanded, the governments tend to turn to the male clerical actors as they try to include more religious actors in peace building. So in both those movements, the movements to include more women and the movement to include more religious actors, women who are religious tend to be left behind. So it's a very interesting kind of double exclusion that they can come up against. Unfortunately, it means in many areas where they have a great deal of relevance and on-the-ground experience, for example, in disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and reconciliation programs, women religious who have a great deal of expertise and local credibility may often be excluded from these formal processes. They have physical networks, physical resources, personnel, money, technical competence, institutional structures, from hospitals to schools, that address many peace-building problems. And in regions of continued and prolonged conflict, when old regimes have been discredited but new institutions are being built, These women's religious institutions and networks and leaders can step into the vacuum. They can be that missing middle to help bridge these institutional gaps. So that's the pros. The cons is these challenges that remain with us. So the prescriptions I would offer today are to expand engagement with these female faces of faith. Expand engagement across wider functions, wider timeline, to expand participation to include women religious peace builders, and to expand our ideas of leaders, who is a leader in a community, to include these women religious actors, to engage women and youth religious leaders who may not be the formal male clerical leaders, and to normalize and integrate that engagement with women religious. We need to understand their strategic invisibility when they choose it for their safety, or they choose it in order to advance particular functions or effectiveness in certain areas, and honor that strategic invisibility that they may have chosen. But also we need to try to find out if there are times when they need to be more visible, and to help them connect and integrate with resources and capacities. Help them to leverage their global decentralized networks in ways that help them to be more strategic, more integrated, more connected, more sustainable. For those of you in the audience who are working for the U.S. government at the U.S. Embassy, you might be asking yourself, well, why should we be interested in engaging with women of faith around the world? Well, for one thing, it's the law and it's U.S. policy. But also, as I pointed out before, it is necessary. In a world of resurgent religion and challenged states, women religious have this needed capacity in war zones. They have these three eyes of institutions, ideas, and imagination. And they can bring a very valuable game changer if we expand our definition of religious leader to include them. But as I said, it is the law. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 mandates that the State Department shall integrate and engage with religious actors. And that means, because we know women are more religious than men, by definition that means engagement with the female face of faith. Women of faith are leaders in peace building, public health, education, refugees, organizations, and efforts against human trafficking. So we have to know who to engage and know who those missing middle leaders might be that we might not think about if we just imagine religious leaders to only be the male clerical leaders. And this, of course, is a picture of Dr. Carolyn Wu, who's head of Catholic Relief Services, a major faith-based humanitarian organization active in peace building. One of the examples of ways of an example in which women religious moved from being reactive peace builders to being much more strategic has been their tremendous engagement on issues of human trafficking. So I'm certain there are members here today at the event who are part of these human trafficking networks, such as Talitha Kum. Those would be examples of ways to take the work that they've been doing in local areas to connect them with national and international networks and resources and be more strategic. Some resources you might consider to look at to know more about the topic we've been discussing are, again, the book that I've referenced throughout, and you'll be hearing more from Susan Hayward this afternoon, and I'm sure she'll be drawing also on this book on women, religious, and peace building. The definition of strategies of peace I've been using comes from the work of John Paul Lederach, and also this book, Strategies of Peace, by my colleagues at the Kroc Institute. And some of this also comes from my own work in Beyond Sovereignty. An additional resource you might want to consider for those of you who are engaged in peace-building activities with children and youth is a training manual of best practices and tools called Live Peace, Teach Peace by my friends MJ and Jerry Parks, who've worked for decades in peace building in the Washington, D.C. area with refugees and victims of torture, folks who fled wars around the world and have ended up in Washington, as well as children who are contending with gang violence and domestic violence. And these are very, very practical tools that they use, so practical exercises and activities. You can open this book and do these activities with your youth groups or schools tomorrow. So that's another resource available to you. Again, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention to this issue. I wish you the best as you continue your work throughout the day in these conversations on how to make women's religious work more strategic in peace building. And I thank you also for your prayers for myself and my family. Good luck with your work, and I wish I could be with you, but feel free to contact me by email or offline after the workshops are over. Have a great day.